Hello and welcome to another episode of Unique Professions. Today we are going to talk about crime reporting, and what it is like to be a journalist. I have former crime reporter Alexis Donkin with me. Alexis, how are you?
Hello, I am fantastic. I'm all the more fantastic for being here, having a chat with you today. Thank you for having me.
No worries. We're going to go way back into time. Now, first question I want to know is, journalism was something I was actually interested in as a young kid, although I've gone on to do other things. I think perhaps maybe this podcast is some kind of way of tapping into that.
I could pick that with you, David.
Yes.
I think it's that inquisitive nature you have. I can imagine you may have had that drawing towards journalism. You love asking questions, so
Yes.
I can imagine it.
So what drew you to journalism to start off with?
Well, look, as I said, an inquisitive nature. I'm a very tenacious person, something that a quality I've had since I was very young. But I think you and I, we've had a chat and a bit of a laugh before. I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I was watching the news with my folks. Now, I should point out at this point that my parents are not journalists. They're not involved in the media in any capacity. So watching the news in our household actually wasn't really a common occurrence anyway. But I loved watching the news, and I was watching Channel 7. It was Rick and Sue. I remember it vividly, almost like it was yesterday. And I turned around to Mum and Dad, and I was just enthralled by the reporters and the stories they were covering. And I said, I'm going to do that one day. I'm going to be a journalist. I'm going to work with Rick and Sue. And I think at that point, honestly, my parents sort of had a laugh and said, that's really great. You know, you can aim towards that, to be a journalist, but probably thought, well, that's one of many things our daughter will want to become when she gets older. But I never swayed, David. From that age until, my adult years, it was always journalism. It was always broadcast, and it was always chasing news and asking the hard questions. So the qualities in me have never really changed. The vision hadn't changed. And well, as we know, I did end up there.
Yes. Now, you said they're chasing stories. Why do you love that so much? What's that thrill to you?
Well, I think there's the thrill side to it, but then there's also an incessant need with me to get to the bottom of things. I've always wanted to know or get to the truth of matters, to find out more. I was raised in a household where education was very important. So that meant learning things, asking questions, learning about different people, where they come from, what they do and why they do things. All of the big questions we ask in journalism: who, what, where, when, why.
How?
That's how.
Yeah.
You've got it, so
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
it. All of those things were very important to me. So I think it's just that nature that led me into it, wanting to know what's going on in the world and why it's happening. I did study at university. Obviously, my major was journalism at Curtin University, but I did a double major of politics as well. Again, asking questions, wanting to know about why the world works the way it does and how we could potentially do it better. And I say that tongue-in-cheek while talking about politics.
Yep. I wonder what we're talking about.
Absolutely. But I think when I combined those two things, journalism was always what I thought was the pathway for me. So political journalism initially was the way I went. But as we know, it didn't stay that way.
Yes. Now, when you first started your career in television, how was that for you, being a young woman? I imagine, in a man's world almost.
Well, it was, and I don't always like to admit that, and I don't like to label myself a feminist, but I think it is fair to say, as a young woman, and I was very young, I was 18 when I started in the 9 newsroom, it was like a man's world. The senior reporting jobs were held mostly by men, predominantly crime. Well, actually, at that point, it was only male crime reporters. So it did feel very much like a man's world. But as a young woman getting into television journalism, we'll have to go way back.
Yep.
So this is going back to, as I said, the days as a teenager. I originally started as a journalist. Well, actually, first I was an assistant chief of staff in the 9 newsroom. but obviously I wanted to get off the Chief of Staff's desk. And for your listeners who don't know what a Chief of Staff does in a newsroom, they're effectively the central node. They pull the stories in each day and they decide which journo fits that story, how they're going to chase it, how they tackle it, and where they go from day to day. They're the node. They keep things ticking in a newsroom. So I was the assistant while I was still at Curtin University finishing my degree. But I knew that I wanted to get out, obviously, and become a journalist. So that's when I moved out as a video journalist, and I covered the Geraldton Midwest patch. So all the way up past Carnarvon, right inland, I covered the towns that a lot of people would have never visited, like Yalgoo, towns that they may have heard of, like Meekatharra. So it was a big patch, and in Geraldton in particular, it was a round of journalism, as we called it. You had a round, so it was sort of a genre of news that you covered. For me, it led me down that pathway of crime reporting, because Geraldton, and no disrespect for Geraldton, because I loved the place. It is an excellent place. There's a lot happening up there, but it does have a high crime rate. Naturally, covering those sorts of stories led me down the pathway of wanting to be a crime reporter. But we did just speak a little bit before, David, about that tenacity and that ambition that I have. And that takes me back even further before I was the Assistant Chief of Staff at Channel 9. While I was a uni student, it's actually part of your course in your second year to do a week's work experience at one of either the news outlets, a newsroom. For me, it was Channel 9. I had done a week's work experience at Channel 9 and managed to go out on the road with many of their reporters, some of their senior reporters. And I remember on one particular day, it was Nadia Mitsopoulos, who was the state political reporter at the time, and it was my second last day. And she said to me, "Hey, Alexis, I'll give you the microphone for this press conference," or a presser, as we called them, at this presser, and you prove to me you can get a question in there with the politicians who were speaking to us on that particular day. I can't remember exactly what the story was, but it was a pack of journalists. It was a big story, political, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get a question in. I'm doing this in inverted commas, I am just a work experience girl from university. How am I going to get a question in with these political reporters? But I did. Mm-hmm. I managed to get a question in, and that feeling of asking the question I wanted to ask, getting it out there, getting a response from the politician, whomever it may have been on that particular day, on that particular story. And it just gave me this fire in my tummy and an assurance that this is the job for me. This is what I really should be chasing. So it was that real confidence boost. And for anyone listening to this podcast that does know a thing or two about journalism, about broadcast and politics, Nadia Mitsopoulos was an excellent political reporter. She is on ABC Radio now, but for many years she was a face that we knew for politics on TV news. Mm-hmm. So that was so big for me. And from then on I knew, keep pushing, Alexis, this is the job for you. At the end of that week's work experience, I went into the news director at the time, who was Adrian Beattie. Tapped on his door and I said, "Oh, excuse me." I was very timid at that point. I wasn't my usual fiery self. "Could I please have a moment of your time?" And I remember he sort of looked me up and down. He was shaping me up because, as we know, journalism is about asking the hard questions. It's about being tenacious, wanting to get to the bottom of a story, the truth. And it's also about writing well, presenting well. But in TV news, let's be honest, it was also about what I looked like. So I could see him have a look up and down and think, right, okay, who is this person? Why is she coming into my office? And I said, "Well, hi, I'm Alexis Donkin. I'm from Curtin University and I've been here for a week and I really love what you're doing here. I desperately want a job here. I'll do anything." And when I say I'll do anything, I'll even clean the toilets here at Channel 9. And he sort of laughed at me and looked at me and thought, okay, well, if she's willing to, offer to clean the toilets, the bathrooms here at Channel 9 Studios, let's go and see what she sounds like. So he said exactly that to me. Let's take you into the recording booth, put your voice down, have a listen to what you sound like and see if it might be a goer. David, I'm pretty certain that the first time I put my voice down in that recording studio. It was pretty terrible. I'd had no training. I was still a uni student at that time. Yeah, I winged it, of course. But he must have seen something, because at the end of that week, I did get a job. And as I've mentioned before, it was an assistant chief of staff first, before being shipped off to the Midwest to cover all of the crime stories, predominantly in that region as a VJ, before then coming back down to Channel 9 as a crime reporter there.
Let's talk about your time in the Midwest, shall we?
Yes.
Now, how was your first experience?
Well, another one that I do remember like it was yesterday. And how could I forget? I think I still have traumatic dreams about it, David. The first story I'd got when I moved up there was actually the day I moved to Geraldton. So my best friend at the time, my dad, and I packed up the car. We drove from Perth to Geraldton, started unloading in my little apartment in the centre of Geraldton. Well, actually, it wasn't the very centre. It was just a little bit out, and in a patch that was a bit of a main thoroughfare, and a little. It was known to encourage a little bit of trouble, but nonetheless, I was up there to do the job, and so I was willing to stick it out and live there, even though I was terrified, absolutely packing my dacks, David. But we got there, started unpacking the house. But the way things worked back then, in particular when you were covering breaking news, crime stories, house fires, murders even, drug deals, police ran off things called scanners.
Yep.
Scanners of
police
scanners, like the police scanners. Yeah.
Back in the day.
Things have changed. They're on the digital systems now, but we used to be able to listen to those. Now, obviously, I wasn't. But the journalist who had covered for Win Television, so Nine's sort of country cousin, had a family who used to listen to the police scanners as a bit of a hobby, but they would ring the journalists in town that they thought were pretty good, they had a connection with, and tip them off about big stories that were happening. Now, if I'm entirely honest, they did earn a buck or maybe a carton of beer here and there for tipping you off to a good story.
Oh, well.
Absolutely.
That's how it worked back in the day.
It did, didn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I got a phone call from them, and at this point I had no idea who they were,
Yep.
But I was aware that there were contacts, shall we say, that were up there feeding in some pretty good stories. They rang me, "Hi Alexis, we've heard about a story, and if you're ready to hit the ground running, you might want to get there. Just north of Geraldton, I'm pretty sure it was around Drummond's Cove. There's been a murder. We don't know exactly what it is, but forensics are there, detectives are there, homicide police. You might want to get there quickly." Dad and I thought, what the heck? What are we doing? But we threw my camera into the back of my Rodeo, which was my work car at the time. I was not a very good manual driver at that point, certainly not a good driver out on those country roads, but hey, we did it. We headed up to Drummond Cove for what we knew as a murder. By the time I'd got there, because remembering I'd driven from Perth, started unpacking my house and then gone to the murder scene, it had largely been packed up. So I'd called my chief of staff back in the newsroom in Perth and said, "Hey, look, I'm here, day one. I'm here with my dad, by the way, so I'm okay, I think. What do I do? Police have gone. I've got some vision on my camera of the house and some remnants of a crime scene. What's next?" They said, "Go and knock on the door. Find out who lives there. What happened? What led to this murder?" So I did that, knocked on the door, and it was terrifying. It was terrifying. Knock on the door, and I was greeted by a pretty scary bloke, let me tell you. He was a big man. My dad's standing back at the Rodeo, sort of ready to speed off if needed. Yep. And I've knocked, and I was greeted by a very unhappy person who did not want me there. It appeared that he had picked up what looked like and I'm not experienced with guns at all, but it looked like a shotgun. Now, he did not point that directly at me. He didn't need to get me off his property. He let a dog out, and it was a rather large Staffy cross something, I don't know, a Mastiff or something, but that dog, it came for me, and I have never run so fast in my life. Now, David, I do run. I love running, but I've never run faster than that. I bolted to the car. I'm screaming at Dad, "Get in, get in." And there's the dog chasing me. Get in the car. But obviously we needed the story, didn't we? We later found out from detectives up there it was a drug deal gone wrong, fairly common. Police knew that house. They knew the people in it. But someone had come on his turf and it ended very badly for that person. I do remember to get that story though, which obviously it was a regional news story, but it did make 9 News at 6 o'clock in Perth because I did stand up on the roof of that Rodeo. It was a very sturdy car, let me tell you, filming on my camera, tripod and all set up on that car, filming the house, got the man yelling whatever it was, some sort of profanities at myself and my dad. We did manage to get some police coming and going in the hours that we spent outside that house. But I got the story. And from that day on, there are many, many stories like that. Some a little less traumatic than others, but that's the name of the game. You do what you have to do within reason to get the story. I was safe. It ended up okay. The dog didn't hurt me, and whatever, if that was that shotgun I saw there, he certainly didn't use that on me. But this is the nature of it, and that's what journalism is about. If you are passionate enough to get that story, to ask those questions, you will pursue it. You know, there are times you think, did I go too far? Did I put myself in harm's way? Well, perhaps yes. But I'm still here talking to you, telling the story. So I did an okay job of getting by, didn't I?
Yes. But also that raises the question of duty of care. You know.
Absolutely. And look, I would have to say that all of the 2 networks I worked for, I was Channel 9 and Wind Television for some years. I think it was about 3 or 4, before going to 7 News, which was, as you know, that was my lifelong dream, to work for, as we called it, the Red Dragon or the Red Demon, because it was the big, scary Channel 7 that was always the number one. They were always, absolutely. I think the news directors and producers do endeavour to ensure that their journalists are safe. But of course, in chasing the big news and getting the scoop, you do go that extra mile. And do we from time to time turn a blind eye to safety first? Well, yeah, I'd say so. You know, would a regular person on a day at work go and knock on the door of a known criminal, a drug dealer, a known murderer, or a convicted drug smuggler, for example? Would they? No, they wouldn't. Do journalists? Yes. Do crime journalists? Absolutely. You bet they do. And I did. So, yeah, duty of care. I do believe that the networks endeavour to do their best, and perhaps even more so these days. They have, as we know, these big media networks are under the watchful eye to ensure that their people are safe and that they're doing the right things with their people. But I'd say there are times that you could call into question the safety and well-being of people, and that's not just the safety and well-being when we're out doing the door knocks, the scary door knocks. That's also mental well-being.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that a bit later.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But before I do that, we're going to fast forward just a little bit. You've mentioned Channel 7.
Yes.
Which you did work for. And you were the senior crime reporter there. So let's start, first off, how you actually got into that role, and then maybe share some of the stories.
Oh, absolutely. I won't share all of them. Some of them are a little scary and not PG rated, but I'll share the best I can.
Yeah. We can have M. Like
yeah, absolutely. So, well, as I said, as a VJ, I started out covering that Midwest Gascoyne patch, and that introduced me to a lot of crime reporting, crime stories. Then I was asked to move back down to Perth as a crime reporter, working with another male reporter. As I said, the crime round was predominantly dominated by male journos, senior male journos, and that was just the nature of it. I think it's partly because it's the way it so often was, but also viewers trusted that older, more distinguished looking male on a story about crime and bad people doing bad things. So that's sort of the way it was, but I was never perturbed by that. I was never put off by the fact that I was young and that I was a woman. I knew I could do the job as well, if not better. So I was put on the round at 9 and built up a bit of a, let's say, a resume of stories, at which point, after a year of crime reporting at 9, 7 gave me the call and said, would you like to come jump ship and come and work for us? which of course it was the dream. Absolutely, I jumped at it. Well, I didn't jump at it on the phone. At first I was like, well, what's in it for me?
Yeah, play it a bit.
Yeah, exactly, David. I had to play it. What's in it for me to come over there? But we knew that was the pathway for me. And I did make it very clear to the news director at the time, who was Sean Menegola, who was known for being a very robust, very hard news director, more old school than a lot of the other news directors of the day, because he was very tough. And if you didn't get a story, I have seen occasions where voices were raised and I may have seen a chair flying across a newsroom from time to time. But hey, I'm not saying that was Sean, but it was a scary time. But they got the stories, the good stories. So I moved over to 7. At the time, the 2 senior crime reporters were, of course, males. But 2 journalists that I had looked up to for many, many years, David Cooper, Grant Taylor. Now, they were some of the best. Anyone who has watched television news and has an interest in crime and what has happened not only in Western Australia in terms of historical crime cases, but across Australia, would be familiar with the journalists David Cooper and Grant Taylor. I was asked to work alongside them, and that was just incredible. The biggest thing I could be asked to do. It was a big ask. It was a frightening ask, but it was something I was willing to do to cover those stories for the #1 network in the country, which it was at that time. I do recall, though, before I'd left 9, it was a number of people who'd said to me, oh, I wouldn't go to 7, Alexis, because, you're a young female. You're not going to be the crime reporter that you are here at 9 over at 7. And my response to that is, like my response to most things, well, watch me. Because if I'm determined enough and I'm committed enough, which I am, then I will do those things and I will be that person. And I did. And it was hard, and I didn't always win at the story. I didn't get every single exclusive I ever wanted. And in fact, I got beaten by 9 or let's say 10 from time to time, but not often. And I did cover crime for 7, and it was incredible. Some of the stories I've covered have impacted my life in an incredibly positive way. Others have affected me on a more deeper level, as they would. We're talking stories of children being harmed or traumatic car accidents that I've seen. I do recall on one particular occasion, one of my contacts was a tow truck driver. And because tow truck drivers, just like police and firefighters and other emergency services, are required to be at accidents soon, very quickly. And I had a tow truck driver that used to call me to these accidents. And on one particular occasion at an accident up in Gidgee-Gannup, I think it was 2J Road, I had, just by chance, because I was in the area on another story, gotten to the scene at the same time or just before police. So what I was met with was an horrific crime scene, and it involved 3 children in the back of a car driven by their mother, who had been hit by a truck which had jackknifed around the bend on 2J Road. Anyone familiar with 2J Road would know how dangerous it is, and at some points along the road it's 110 kilometres an hour. So this truck had jackknifed and hit that family's car. No one survived it, besides the truck driver obviously in the other vehicle, the truck. He was on the other side of the road, and what I saw were the remains of those children, or one child, for lack of a better word, hanging from the vehicle. They're the sort of scenes that you are not often greeted with, but from time to time you need to be prepared that you will be greeted with. And that will forever stay with me. It was an accident, but it was horrific. It was a story that we were not very popular in telling, like so many others. Why are journalists, the leeches of society, preying on everyone's despair and misery, of course. But it's the job of a journalist to tell the story that these things are happening, and so that was a terrible one, and there are many like it. But I should also point out that even though I was a crime reporter, I did a lot of positive stories, and I saw some wonderful things. Out of bad news so often comes really good news. You see the generosity from societies. I would cover so many fires. I was at one point for quite a few years known as the fire reporter in Western Australia. Whenever there was a fire, there was me running around in the big orange media jacket chasing fires with my camera operators, and just, it was full on, but it was the life that I led. And those were devastating. I remember at one particular fire down at Yarloop, it was an assistant chief of staff's family who lost a home in that fire, and I'd ended up at the property, which was a crisp, absolutely burnt to the ground. And by chance, she said, I'm related to one of your colleagues. And that was a story we covered. Out of that horrible story about a family losing their home of, I think it was 15 or 20 years, was a beautiful story about a community's generosity, offering them clothes, a place to stay, or helping them get books because the kids at the end of summer were about to return to school. So with the bad comes the good. And with those, some of those terrible stories I was covering came a lot of personal learning as well, which was really interesting. But a whole array of stories, and I could go for hours, David, but I know we don't have that much time, so I'll stop there.
What kind of personal learnings do you actually, what did you, during those times?
What did I learn? I think...
What's some of the most valuable?
Some of the most valuable learnings, I think for me, was not to react every time someone else did something, or every time you came across a particular story. To learn to, and I apply this to my life even now, as we know, I'm no longer a journalist, I'm a media advisor, but something I apply to all of my life is when I hear something, read something, or come across something, to learn to sit with it, to, before you react to a situation, to figure out how you feel about it and what is the best response. Not everything deserves a response. When you look at journalism and the learnings you can take from that, you are often, again, as a crime reporter, met with some not so nice people. Not all, but a lot were some pretty terrible people. Stories chasing criminals outside of courthouses, and their reaction to your questions were to spit on you or to spit in your face. And I can't tell you how many times that had happened to me over my career. But you need to learn how to respond to that, and often it wouldn't be a response. But also then when you go home with a story and it impacts you on a deeper level, then how do you deal with it? For many years I brushed things under the carpet. To deal with things, I probably had one too many drinks and didn't open up about how I truly felt about things with people. For a while, maybe it affected some of my relationships in my 20s. I was still learning about life in general, let alone covering horrific stories, not only in Western Australia, but as we know, I was a foreign correspondent for a while as well, working predominantly in Southeast Asia, covering some horrible stories there, which we'll get to. But it was learning how to deal with my own emotions, as well as how to deal with those around me. Journalism takes a very robust person, someone who can ask hard questions and has thick skin. They're not nice stories always to be covering. But it also requires you to have a soft side. You cannot be a good journalist, I don't believe, without having a soft side. You need to feel it as well. When you're asking those questions, if I can't feel how you are feeling about it or responding, then I can't really ask the next question. There is no such thing as a right question, but there is a question that will get the response from you that really tells us something about the story or what's happened or how you're feeling. And we watch the news not only to learn about what is happening in our communities or societies, but also there is a factor, I don't know if entertainment is quite the right word, but we want to feel something when we watch it, because some of these are horrible stories and they do carry emotions and deep feelings with them. So there were a lot of learnings. Have I got it all down pat? Oh, you bet I have not, but I do try.
Yeah. Now, I am interested, I am going to go back into the doom and gloom just for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
We will be light very soon, don't worry.
That's absolutely fine.
But no, when you are covering these or seeing these things, on the road, dead bodies, basically, obviously that's, for me, that I would say that's very traumatic. How did you, resolve that trauma? that you saw, because you saw things almost on a day-to-day basis of things, and ambulance officers, police officers would have a lot of counselling and grief training and trauma, but not so much journalists. How do you?
Absolutely, David, and this is something I have discussed with my current colleagues, who many of whom are not journalists and have not been journalists before. And just like the conversation we're having here today, I have shared some of the stories I've covered and the things that I've seen with them, and their response is always one of complete shock with some of those stories, as you can imagine. And often the question is, well, what support were you offered? And it has led me in my years post-journalism to realise that there wasn't a lot of support. Can I go as far as to say there wasn't a duty of care? Well, no, I can't, because your news directors, your producers and your colleagues would always ask if you were okay. We did check in on one another. And as I've said, a chief of staff knows where you are at every point of the day at all times, so they knew where you were. But in terms of on an emotional level and some of the scarring that this sort of work has on you, no, I don't believe that journalists do have the same level of support as others. We talk about emergency responders, firefighters, police, paramedics and others who arrive at these scenes, whether it's a car crash, a plane crash, a murder scene or a drug scene, or perhaps even a terrible fight on the street. And it's part of their job and their roles, that they are offered support. In fact, it's mandatory in many of those roles after the things that they see to receive that counselling or support. What we often forget, especially when we're pointing the finger at journalists saying they're horrible people chasing people's misery and despair, is that we are confronted with a lot of the same things, not to the same extent. We don't walk into the crime scenes that police do or paramedics, but we are there and we witness parts of it. And it also has an effect on us. Remember, journalists are still humans. We're doing a job, but we're still humans and we feel too. And there isn't that same level of support. Did I ever go and ask for it? Perhaps I didn't think I needed it. And did I? No, maybe I didn't. I moved on to another career and I loved what I did. I was wildly passionate. And would I change anything? No, I wouldn't. But there are times you look back as an older and I hope wiser woman and think, maybe I should have spoken to someone about what I saw. It was hard. I was 25 and I was covering a story about a mother going through a divorce who murdered 2 of her daughters and then turned the knife on herself. And that is a story that I covered. A story that even saw police officers of more than 3 decades on the force walk away from the job and say, enough's enough now. I've done it. I can't deal with this anymore. So I do believe that there is more support that could be offered to journalists. I've been out of the game for quite a few years now. Do I know exactly what support or counselling may be there for journalists if they need it? No, I don't know exactly. But I hope there is support there for them, especially those journalists like myself who are younger, willing to chase that little bit harder to prove that they're good enough and that they can get the story, that are seeing a lot of things. The world has changed. They don't have the same access to stories that we did when I was reporting. Yep. As we say, everything's moved to digital. Yep. Journalists aren't arriving to the crime scenes quite as early as we used to get that scoop. However, there's still big, tough stories to be covered, and I would hope that those journalists are receiving support. Young, old, male, female, any of them. It's not an easy job. It's a very admirable job.
Now, you've actually raised something quite interesting there. That times have changed since you have been a reporter, and how we consume media is much different. Because back in the day, it's the 6 o'clock news was pretty much your main news bulletin that most people would watch, whether it be Channel 7, 9 or ABC, whichever, and the newspaper in the morning. Absolutely. As well. But now you've got, if you want media, if you want the latest news story, it's on your phone, it's on your tablet, it's everywhere. So how do you think you would survive this world as a journalist, as a crime reporter? How would you have to change would you have to change your style?
I'm so glad you've raised this, David, because the way we consume news really has changed. And as you say, we can get the news of the day on our mobile phones at any moment. It's at the touch of a button, isn't it? So the way in which news is now being delivered is also very different. I think a lot of my drive to be a broadcast journalist for the 6 o'clock news, which was the news that we all turned on and watched at the end of the day, whether we were cooking dinner or having a family meal, it was always sort of the news in the background for many, many people. That's how they received it, or they'd buy the paper in the morning and read the paper. But again, there's been this shift. It's a lot of digital news, but also let's talk about the rise of social media. And that's where a lot of people are getting their news. Now, there are a lot of credible news sources on social media. I do myself, even as a former journalist, love to pick up, I could even say LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, one or the other, and see that ABC has done a short 30 to 60 second video encapsulating a story of the day, whether it is a politically based, crime based, or just a current affairs style story. Now, that enables me to get the news that I want, that is informative, fast, and also I can, let's hope, trust the news source. But we've also got to be very careful, because what also happens with receiving our news from, let's say, social media or other online sites that are perhaps less credible than the other news outlets, is that we are receiving news that isn't correct, isn't factual. Fake news, as we have heard so many times. Yes. But we can't be sure that what we're consuming is factual or correct. And we've got to be careful of that. In the same way we have people sitting for many years in their armchairs watching the news, we now have people sitting in their armchairs thinking it is their right or responsibility to deliver the news from that very same armchair, because we have the ability to do so. If you've got a mobile phone, a video or a camera, a social media account, you can jump on and share with your community or the people around you what you think is happening or what you've heard. It doesn't always mean that what we're receiving is right, is fair, is correct. So news has really changed, and often I will see senior crime reporters or other journalists who we watch on the news delivering stories of the day on those social media platforms, short videos often filmed off mobile phones, because the consumer is receiving it there. So the news outlets have to shift to that. I don't. I've taken my foot off the accelerator a bit with trying to keep on top of all of the news ratings. I don't see them all the time, not as much as I used to. My new job keeps me very busy, yep. But I do know that the ratings aren't what they used to be, that television news in particular does struggle, as we've said, because people are consuming their news in other ways, on other platforms as well. So the times have changed.
Besides dwindling ratings for Channel 7 and 9, News 6 o'clock, do you think, though, having that news available 24/7 means that it's more diluted? It's, and perhaps some of those important stories that you cover kind of get lost, with more things, like, oh, look, some cat lived 100 years old. Although that's very exciting and interesting, it's, probably not, high profile.
That's a really interesting question. Are we missing out on some of the big stories? I'd say we're not missing out on the big stories. But are we missing out on the most factual or important part of those stories?
And are we choosing to, the fluffiest
how
stuff?
And what we consume? Yeah. Absolutely. What we've also got to remember is that journalists are qualified storytellers. They are storytellers at the end of the day, but trained to get to the truth, to the bottom of a matter, whether it's political, criminal, or whatever it may be. They have the news sources, the contacts. They are speaking to the politicians about legislation or matters before Parliament. If we're talking about legal matters, the journalists are sitting in the courtroom hearing it firsthand from lawyers, judges and others. So we can only hope that we are getting the most factual version of events. The concern with having news so readily available and being delivered to us by sources that are often not credible is we may be getting the story of the day, but are we getting the true story, the fair, the accurate story? Perhaps not. We're getting the news, we're getting a lot of it, but are we getting the right version of it, or are we consuming material that is factually incorrect or misleading in some way? And that is a concern because it distorts people's views and beliefs in things. And we know when that happens, it can lead to other problems in societies and a lack of acceptance and people forming views that aren't based on fact. And that is a worry, obviously. But of course, there is, still those news sources out there, outlets doing the right thing, journalists that are getting the real true stories that we want to be hearing so that we know what's going on in our communities and beyond.
Now, earlier you mentioned that you were the foreign correspondent, and I understand that there is a certain story that really shaped you.
Absolutely. Look, yes, it was MH370.
The missing plane.
The missing plane. The plane that quite literally disappeared. How on earth could that happen? Oh gosh, David, I think it was a Friday night. And I say night lightly because it might have been about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and I'd been out and about doing other things. Journalists sometimes still have a life, I can say. And I we can only try.
Yeah.
And my news director had called me, Donks, where are you? And I think I said, I'm at home, music blaring in the background, probably 3 wines deep. I need you to pack a bag, get to the airport, a plane has disappeared. And I, at that point, laughed. I mean, a plane's disappeared. What do you mean? How can a plane disappear? It has quite literally disappeared. Get to the airport, pack your bag, go. You're off to Malaysia. MH370, as we know, that flight was off the flight radar, not to be seen. I met my camera operator and crew at the airport. We flew to Malaysia. Whatever hours of the morning. I remember we arrived in Malaysia and we were running at that point on Sydney time, so they were hours ahead and needed a live cross. We weren't ready. I hadn't gotten the full story at that point, remembering I'd been on a plane for however many hours prior to that. But we had to do a live cross on the side of the road. We are here in Malaysia and told the story as we could. What was meant to be a few days covering a story about MH370 missing ended up being at least 3 weeks covering the story in Malaysia, day, night. It was, the first week was almost 20 hours a day coverage. It was intense. It was coverage for all of the Australian 7 network, but also I was doing breakfast appearances for television stations around the world. I remember doing London breakfast at one point. My brother lives there and I'm pretty sure he managed to tune in and see his sister on the news that particular day. But it was a big story. It was an evolving story, and it was a highly, highly emotive story because obviously you have a plane with hundreds of people on board that has quite literally disappeared. People from all over the world. Their families had arrived in Malaysia. We were in Kuala Lumpur. They wanted answers. They wanted to know, how can this happen and where are they? Are you going to find them? They're the questions they were asking of authorities. And after weeks and weeks of false hope, it was getting harder to cover. I remember one particular day, through no fault of the authorities in Malaysia, they called a snapshot press conference. We've got news to share. And I was mid-live cross at that point, I think to Sydney or a Melbourne news bulletin, and I said, my camera operator's behind the camera saying, Donks, it's time to cut. We cut it. We've gone into the press conference room and you've got media from all over the world there. And I think I was quite often perched between 9 News Australia, CNN, and one of the others, I think from a London program, a radio program, because they were always chewing my ear off. But so we got in there and we were told a piece of what appears to be a plane has been found in waters off Vietnam. I was about to jump on a plane to Vietnam to find out what it was. It was a false alarm. I believe it was part of a yacht had been floating, but they thought it may have been something. When that press conference had been called, I remember we were heading down into this, and a number of the families had seen that the media were rushing to that press conference room. And as they've seen, they thought, something's been found. Is it my family? At that point, I remember it was predominantly a large group of Chinese families who had been there from day one, from the day I had been there when this had first happened, the news had broke. And they've gone rushing to an elevator to get down in time to get to the conference room. Of course, they weren't meant to head to that conference room. It was for media only. But they heard something had happened, something had been found. They wanted to get in there too. As they've pushed to go down the elevator, they've pushed a bunch of people. There's camera operators, and you've seen their gear. They've carried big, heavy cameras, tripods, lights. We're trying to get down. As these families have come down, they've almost stampeded down, pushed us down this elevator. We've gone plummeting down. and landed on the bottom underneath, I don't know how many people, but it was quite full on. We managed to get up and get into the press conference. Relatively unscathed, maybe a few little cuts and bits and pieces, but we were okay. But this was the intensity of this story in Malaysia at the time, because weeks and weeks with no answers, how can this happen? And that was a story that will forever be, I will carry close to me, because I saw the effect it was having on those families. I was watching the impact that my reporting on a particular story was having on the people almost in real time, because I was there with them. We did a lot of our coverage from the airport. We stayed at the hotel at the airport for that entire 3 weeks. So you were seeing it play out bit by bit, step by step, day by day. It was intense. It was a real learning curve as a journalist, but also as a human being, to see what these stories, these impacts, these things can have on everyday people. And let's not forget that I think it was only a matter of weeks or even a few months later, MH17 was shot down, a story of which I also covered. So stories that have a very, very big impact. No matter how far away they are from home, from our own backyard, they still hit very hard. So yes, there are certainly stories to be told on that particular work-away trip as a correspondent.
Now, of course, with crime, you always have, in any crime story, no matter if even if it's a work of fiction, you always have a perpetrator and a victim. Mm. How do you, as a journalist, marry those two together? How do you work with a perpetrator of a crime and a victim? How do you marry those together? Do you do things differently? Whether
Well, it's a hard one, because obviously the number one rule for a journalist is to always be subjective.
Yep.
But we don't have opinions, we don't have views, and people are innocent until proven guilty. And quite often the lines are skewed between victim and perpetrator. If we are talking about a story where 2 drug dealers have ended up in a biffo and one has come off worse than the other, for example, that first story in Geraldton I told you about, who is the victim here can be quite difficult. But there are those stories where there is a genuine victim, an innocent person in their home when they're broken into, and someone comes in and clouts them over a head with a weapon to steal a necklace or $50 cash or whatever it might be. And so often in the stories I covered, those people were the elderly living alone. They were vulnerable members of our community anyway. How do you work with those people and those stories? Well, often I was told, and I think on occasion my own mother said, I think you lack empathy. Maybe that's why you're a good journo. But I do believe I do have a lot of empathy, and you would apply that to a story, and you would learn how to be more gentle with people when you were interviewing them. You learn to read the room a little better when you're a journalist. How can I approach this person? What questions can I ask, or should I ask, and what is going too far? I would always be able to gauge from someone I was interviewing whether I could go the extra mile. You would start off relatively gently and then move into the questions, and you would tend to know where you could go and where you couldn't. That was experience. That was also just being intuitive, and I do believe I am a fairly intuitive person. So that's how I applied I suppose, not a rule, but a way of doing things to each story. And every story is different. But with experience came better skills in dealing with different people. I do recall one of the hardest stories I covered, one of the most horrific, and I briefly touched on it before, and I won't go into it too much. But it was a story about a mother going through a divorce who was facing some serious mental health issues. It was up in Port Denison, and for those that aren't familiar, Port Denison is a town just south of Geraldton, a beautiful town on the water there, known for fishing and other things. But this particular mother, who was in a custody battle with her husband as well as the divorce, had 2 of her young daughters at home with her at the time. The eldest daughter was at home with Dad in Perth. Yep. But it led to, and I won't go into the details, but she had murdered her 2 daughters and then turned the knife on herself. Now, we know what happened in that home on that particular night because the woman had left messages in the home for her husband and for authorities. And that is the story I told you. Very experienced police officers said, "I'm done, I'm walking away now." That was a story that once it was covered was hard enough as it was. Obviously, what we might call perpetrator in this story was also a victim because she was suffering severe mental health problems and going through a very incredibly tough time. And questions were asked at the time we covered this story, and I was one of a number of crime reporters at the time. But the questions were along the lines of what could have been done to prevent this? What could have been done to help this woman that would have stopped this from happening? Because this is a very extreme case. So it led to an inquest some 4 or 5 years later. Forgive me, I don't remember the exact dates. But the inquest was held up at Geraldton Courthouse, remembering this double murder-suicide happened in Port Denison, just south of. I was working for Seven at this time, and I went up to Geraldton to cover the story. Well, the inquest. It was the first time we had been given access to the father of these young girls, remembering he was the husband at the time going through that divorce. Now, he had one living daughter because she had been in Perth with him at the time this happened. The inquest went on for several days, and as journalists, we made a decision not to approach him in those first few days, to let the inquest play out, to hear some of the facts as to what had happened in the lead up to this incident, this horrible, tragic incident, and also what happened after and what the authorities had or had not been doing at the time. It was about day 3, I think, and as the father had come out, journalists, doing what journalists do, wanted to get in there to get the question and to get the what we called a grab, which is a snippet of someone saying something in front of the camera for the nightly news or the paper or whatever it was. As I spoke to you before about reading the room and trying to gauge how the person I'm interviewing is feeling and how they're coping. And I saw an opportunity to ask him what others may have thought was a silly question. There are no wrong questions, as you know, but others might have thought, well, that's a bit of a silly question. But mine was based on experience and seeing the way he was feeling. I jumped in and I simply said, "How are you feeling? How are you?" And everyone just stopped. And it was the only time he looked up because he was like just the Walking Dead. I mean, to live through something like that, you could not even imagine it. And he looked at me. He looked me in the eye and the tears were welling. And it was the first time and perhaps the only time in my entire career that the tears were welling in my eyes too. And he said, "Thank you. Thank you for asking that. I think I'm doing okay." And he responded to that about how he'd been trying to deal with the loss of his 2 daughters. And it was just so powerful and so poignant. And as I said, it almost feels like a silly question. How are you? How are you feeling? I mean, what a question to ask after losing your 2 daughters and then wife. But it was the question. It was the question he wanted asked. And it was the question that got the real answers to see how a father was coping. And it led to what he would like to see done to prevent it ever happening ever again to someone else. But that, I suppose, encapsulates how I dealt with each story. You see who you were working with or dealing with or speaking to on a particular story. What was the story? How do I, as a human and as a journalist, approach that? And it did come with experience. But everyone's different, and not all people are quite as responsive to a journalist's questions, let me tell you. Some people don't want to talk to you at all, but some people do want to be asked, and it's important that there are people like journalists out there that are still asking the questions and getting to the bottom of things.
Now, at the very start of the interview, you discussed, you were a bit timid when Nadia was, asked you to say, "Here, come, have the microphone."
Yes.
How from that moment till towards the end of your reporting career, did you develop? How did you get that tenacity? How did you come from that being a bit shy and then just really hard hitting and with that tenacity?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think with every story came a new confidence and a new skill and a new ability to deal with things. Every story was a piece of experience. I mentioned before, every story was like adding in something else to your resume, to your skill set, another string in the bow, if you will. So confidence came with experience. But I think also I have always been fairly confident. I do suffer a little imposter syndrome. I think many of us do. Perhaps I'm a little better at dealing with it than others, or perhaps I'm just better at hiding it. My parents used to say to me, well, if you're worried, just fake it till you make it. We're all just doing our best anyway. And I did apply that to journalism a lot, especially, as I said, as a young female on the crime round with a lot of experienced, much older men earning a lot more money than me. But I think I did always have a confidence in myself. I was raised to have a belief in myself. I also believe that education is a tool of empowerment. I was educated, and so that helped me as well. So I think I combined those things. But again, obviously there were times where I was absolutely packing it. I was terrified. And there were times, even as an experienced journalist, I was nervous about asking a question or the right question. There were times where you're doing back-to-back live crosses and you start to doubt, am I presenting as well as I should? Of course, we're only human, but I think the more years I did the job, the more years I asked the questions, covered the stories, I learnt more about the job itself. I learnt more about myself, and I think journalism is a lot like life in general. The more we do, the more we learn about ourselves, and we either have to accept that or become more comfortable with it. And the things we don't really like, then we do something about it. Journalists are all about action, people that work hard and chase things. So I believe, well, in my own case, I applied a tenacity to stories. I applied that chase and drive to my own self and to the person that I am. I did always chase hard stories, and I wanted to win. I wanted the scoop. I wanted lead story on Channel 7 at 6 o'clock. Don't you worry. But did I ever undercut? Did I ever play dirty? No, I didn't. I can quite comfortably lay in my bed at night and tell you that I was always honourable in the things that I did and the decisions that I made. Because I believe that is so important. Journalism and becoming a respected journalist with a big fat contact book also means gaining trust and respect. And if you have to bend the rules and to harm other people or undercut people to get to the top, then perhaps you're not as good and you're not as deserving of that trust and respect. And so I stuck to my guns, and I didn't try to win by doing the wrong thing. I won because I was the most tenacious, or I knocked on that door an extra time, or I stayed at a crime scene 2 hours more than any other journalist rather than going home at night. That is what led me to achieve the things I did as a journalist. But as we know, later on in my 30s, I decided it was time to move on to other things.
Yes, now we will talk about that in a sec. Was there a moment in time that you decide, you know what, I've had me run, this is it. And what did that moment look like?
Yeah, look, David, really good question. It wasn't a particular moment in time. It was a series of moments in time. Yeah. It was something I was feeling for a while. And I was honest with my news director of the day about it, that I felt like perhaps my performance was ailing somewhat because I was feeling a little burnt out. Remembering, unlike a lot of journalists, I got in very young. I was still in my second year of journalism and politics at university, and I was working full-time. Fortunately, I was able to get my degree in that last 6 months externally. So I started young. I started covering big things and seeing a lot of things at a young age. So I did. I had a lot of experiences very quickly. So I discussed with my news director doing some more producing, coming off the road and working more behind the scenes. But that didn't re-energise me enough. And it was at that point I started looking at where else I could take my skill set as a journalist who liked to ask questions, get to the bottom of stories, find out more about what's going on in the world, but in a different capacity, which is what led me to my job as a media advisor. I'm sharing stories. I'm still a storyteller, but I do it about different content and different things, more positive research breakthroughs and things like that. But I wanted to continue to keep that spark that I believe I've always had. But I felt as though I could no longer apply it to crime and to the hard things. And I make no mistake that I didn't want to cover the soft news stories.
Yep.
Again, inverted commas. I didn't like that kind of reporting. That wasn't for me. And that's when I decided it was time to say goodbye to journalism and to Channel 7. Not an easy decision. Not when it's a lifetime of love and passion, and thankfully turned out to be quite good at it too. But it was a decision that I had discussed with my family over quite some time, years even. And looking back, it was the right decision. I love what I do, and I still get to be tenacious, and I still get to love what I do and chase hard to get things out there, but in a very different capacity and dealing with different people too.
And when you look back on your career as a crime reporter, as a journalist, what do you think maybe some of your former colleagues would find the most admiring qualities of your journalism?
I would say don't sacrifice your own ethics and morals to get the story. As I've said, one thing I never did was sacrifice what I believed in to get a story. I knew that I could get it, even sticking to my guns. I believe that you need a good moral fibre to be a journalist, to be a good journalist. That's not saying we don't break the rules. It's not saying that from time to time you don't go down a road you're not supposed to at a fire so that you could get a particular shot, or you maybe have told a fib to a news director from time to time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about the real morals and ethics. What has shaped you as a person to make a decision to be a storyteller and to be someone in an important position in society, telling the stories, informing your communities about what's happening and what affects them. Stick to your guns, stick to your ethics, your morals, carry it with you, because I guarantee you can still be a senior reporter or a senior crime reporter. You can still be noticed and stick to that moral fibre. Don't sacrifice who you are for the job. Go the extra mile. Sit there for the extra 5 hours at the crime scene or out in the bush. I remember sometimes I had no toothbrush and no change of underwear, but I did it for the story. But I was still me, and I would always stick to my guns, and I believe that's really important.
And with that moral fibre, as we are talking about, you do have an influence in that role on other people, not just the viewer, but also the people that you are reporting about as well. Because not only do they have families as well, and so there is that two-way street as well.
Absolutely. It is. I think journalism is such an important job, and even though we have touched on how things are changing and the way in which we consume our news, journalists will always have a crucial role in society. And even though many people like to point stick at journalists and say they're just bad people, they're leeches, they chase all the doom and gloom, I think we need to accept that even the people who are poking stick at journalists, often they're the ones that are watching the news, reading the paper, jumping online to see what's happening, to find out what's going on in their community, what politicians are doing what. So I think we need to remember how important those roles are. They will always be a crucial part of society. And I think journalists, the ones that do the right thing and that do have this moral fibre that we've just discussed, they have a real opportunity to keep, as they used to say in politics, keep the bastards honest. I think journalists have a really important role to play in doing that, keeping people honest, keeping them accountable. I have no problem keeping my husband accountable, so let's do it. Let's have journalists who keep the politicians accountable. It's really important. And I must say, even though I have left the industry, I'm not working as a journalist, I still admire the work that's being done out there. I know firsthand it's not an easy job, and I know firsthand it's long hours, it's hard slog. So I really respect the work that they're doing. And I think even though we don't always agree with the way things are done, and it is hard news to swallow, excuse the pun there, but
Yep.
it is hard to consume the news at times, but journalists are just doing the best job they can do in most cases. Certainly the ones I worked with.
And yeah, now I'm just wondering, why is crime? Why do we love it so much? And crime has been around, not just journalism, but we love crime stories, crime movies, crime TV, true crime, you name it.
Absolutely. Look, David, we've discussed this before. I think really people do have a bit of a morbid obsession, and I use that word lightly, but this obsession with the bad, with the doom and the gloom and the bad things that are happening. Often we hear, let's move away from the news for a moment. Yeah. The crime documentaries, true crime, it's the number one genre. It's what people are listening to and engaging with. Why does it take us in our everyday lives to another place? Do we have a bit of a need to know about the scary, the evil, the bad? I think there's also the flip side, back onto the news side of things. We do want to know what's happening in our communities. And let's be honest about it, a lot of bad things happen a lot of the time. And it doesn't matter where you live. You know, we can't say that crime is confined only to the bad or the lower socioeconomic areas. That is simply not the case. Some of the most horrible crime stories I've covered are in the most affluent parts of Perth or Sydney even.
Look at the Claremont.
Absolutely. But people want to know these things. Why are we so obsessed with it? Not exactly sure. Does it carry some entertainment value with it? Yeah, I believe it does. But there's also that need and want to know. And obviously, quite often, it's the bad things that do make news headlines locally, nationally, and around the world. And that is just the way it is. Unfortunately, those good, positive, and heartwarming stories are not going to lead the news bulletin. But I will point out there, David, that the highest rating point of a news bulletin is sport and weather. People do love their sport and weather, so I will say that.
Yes. Well, true crime's interesting because a lot of, as you know, a lot of streaming platforms, have different, dramatisations. One that I watched a couple of months now was the Lyle and Eric Menendez Monsters.
Yes.
Back in before I watched the dramatisation of it, I vaguely remember the case, vaguely. And then after I watched the dramatisation, I went back and had a look at it. So for me it was that morbid fascination. It was like, hang on, from what I've watched, even though it's drama, it's a little bit, they do take a bit poetic license, as I like to call it.
Yes.
I was still interested. Did that really happen? And then, I was able to, kind of pick out the pieces. And that case was actually quite interesting in itself, because after that dramatisation, and because it got really, really popular, they actually now have reopened that case. So
and this is what happens with the way in which we consume the news or events around the world. There are so many ways that we're consuming it, that stories don't have the lifespan that perhaps they once did, because they are re-emerging in different platforms, whether it's social media or documentaries, podcasts and the like. So news finds new life and new forms and new storytellers to tell the story. And that's why, again, the stories are so important, and the people telling them are just as important, because there's such an important role that they have in telling those stories and influencing the people watching them.
I just thought this one was quite interesting, because now, because we've consumed this, now we've actually got the ramifications of it is maybe back in the day that technology missed something. Now we can have another look at it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that might happen more often these days.
I think it's exciting to see how it all goes with all of the technology available to us. I think things will continue to change and evolve.
So, a couple more final questions. How is your new role that you've been doing now? How is that? How is your skills that you've developed over your time as crime reporting? How have you, moulded them into your new role?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think we see a lot of journalists move from their original roles into roles like mine as media advisors, because it still has very heavily that storytelling component. The difference is that the stories we are telling are very different. So in my current role as a media advisor in the higher education sector means that I'm sharing stories with the media and the public about breakthroughs, whether it's in the medical world, cyber, and we're sharing breakthroughs in that capacity. But the skill set I've carried is asking the questions, finding the best way to tell the story, to share it with the world, to share it, in my case, with the media, which is really important. I think no matter what happens over time, storytelling is always going to be a part of life. And that is still what I do every day. But as I said, I'm telling different types of stories to a different audience, and perhaps a little more positive. These are stories we want to hear about how we can move towards let's say, a greener future, or breakthroughs in medications or treatment for melanoma and other things. So telling some positive stories, and I can say I go home feeling a little bit lighter at the end of the day. That's for sure.
I do have one final question. As we have discussed, news has moved, the way that it's presented has moved, it's been very different. How do you think, if you were still a crime reporter or a reporter today, how would you work with the way that news is being delivered now? Would you change your approach?
I don't think I would change the way I approach the story itself, but perhaps the way in which the means at which you tell it would be different. So, for example, back when I was reporting, things were different. The main focus would be the 6 p.m. news, and everything was thrown at that. And that would mean we'd have a 7 News helicopter flying above the scene, while we had 3 live link trucks and 2 crews, or 3 crews, even 4, swarming a crime scene, getting everything we could for the news at 6 o'clock. But because that has shifted, and the news is being consumed minute by minute, hour by hour each day, the story itself is the same, or we've got to tell it a particular way, but the way in which we do it is different, insofar as you might be doing it in an online platform as well, or using radio more often than not. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't be doing live radio crosses throughout the day and then the 4:30 or 6 o'clock news at night. But the news is so instantaneous now because it is online, and people aren't always going to wait till the 6 o'clock news. So I would have to be telling it throughout the day as well. But I will leave that very good and important job to the current journalists, and I think some of them are doing a pretty good job, I'll say. So there are some good ones out there, David.
Excellent. Well, Alexis, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you for having me.
No worries. Thank you.